And we, in a sense, had allies on both sides, German allies, and we were still allied with the Soviets.
One of the other very critical events in more contemporary history, which has been written about at great length, but I think has been uniquely presented in your book, both because of your position at the time in the Pentagon, which gave you a particular angle on it, and also your subsequent work as an historian. And I'm talking about the Bay of Pigs, which, according to your book, did not at all occur in the way that most official history is presented today. I'd like you to maybe tell our audience a little bit about that, because it's such a critical event.
Well, I went into the Pentagon in 1955, and the National Security Council had just directed that whenever the United States was involved in clandestine activities, that clandestine activity would be supported by the military, but managed by the CIA. This is the first time they defined it that way and clearly. So the Chief of Staff Air Force called me in and said, look, we want you to set up this organization, a global organization, to provide the military support that is requested for the clandestine activities of CIA. Now, this got to be a very large organization because we had operations in Indonesia, in Tibet, well, all over the world. So in that capacity, early in 1960, I was approached by two CIA men who told me about the plan that eventually became the Bay of Pigs. It wasn't called that then, but it was eventually became that. And they needed a base to train Cuban exiles. So we arranged to fly to Panama, and we opened up Fort Gulick, a base that had been closed. It was a very fine facility, just exactly what they wanted. And the training began at Fort Gulick, and we had to provide them with housing, with doctors, and everything else it took to train the Cuban exiles. Then we built an air base at Retalileo in Guatemala, and another one in Puerto Cabezas in Nicaragua, a big base near Lake Pontchartrain near New Orleans, and of course the biggest CIA station in the world in the Miami area, all the time enlisting Cubans. So that by the time of the presidential election in 1960, Kennedy versus Nixon, this was a very big issue, this business of overcoming Castro in Cuba. And it's kind of interesting because a lot of people concede that Kennedy defeated Nixon because of his sense of the Cuban invasion requirement in the fourth debate, when he said that we ought to be preparing ourselves to remove Castro, and Nixon didn't say anything, as he later said, because he knew the plan was in effect and it was highly classified, and he assumed Kennedy didn't. But for example, the debate was in October. In August of 1960, again, because of my job, I was sent to the Senate office building, to Senator Kennedy's office. I had to bring 2 staff cars over there, and there were 4 men in the office, Cubans, and they were the head of what became the Bay of Pig program. One of them was De Verona, another one Codon, and Manuel Artima. Artima was the military commander on the beach. Picked them up and came. Well, Kennedy knew them. They were already there. They'd been talking to each other. Kennedy had known them. Artima had been at his home at West Palm Beach. People think Kennedy didn't know what was going on, or that he didn't know the Cubans and didn't know their aspirations. He certainly did. He knew before many others did. And then I brought them over to the Pentagon to meet with the Secretary of Defense at the time, who was Mr. Gates. But you see, people attribute to Kennedy a lack of knowledge of this, when really that's not accurate. And from this beginning, we finally got to the point where a brigade had been formed and trained and equipped to invade Cuba, and at the Bay of Pigs. And the requirement, the absolutely essential requirement of that attack was that every Castro combat aircraft would be destroyed before the brigade landed at dawn on April 17th. Now, there were only 10 planes. It wasn't a big deal. On Saturday morning, the 15th, 7 of the 10 had been destroyed. But 3 jets, 3 we call T-birds, T-33s, had flown down to Santiago, Cuba, quite by chance. And our U-2s found them that afternoon. So on Monday morning, before dawn, 4 B-26s were ordered by President Kennedy himself to attack those jets and destroy them. Now, this is very crucial, because if those 3 planes were destroyed, there were no aircraft for Castro's Air Force. There would be no requirement for air cover and all these stories that have developed since then. The facts are that Kennedy, on that Sunday afternoon, when he approved the landings, with the proviso that there be this airstrike to destroy them. And that's the critical step in the Bay of Pigs understanding, that Kennedy did not withhold air cover or anything else. He followed the plan as it was drawn by a very able Marine colonel and approved by the Joint Chiefs of Staff to destroy all combat aircraft. And they weren't destroyed. That was the problem.
What happened? Why weren't they destroyed?
Well, this is a bit of history, and it's contentious, I'll admit. But this document is the document prepared by the Cuban Study Group. The Cuban Study Group was assigned by Kennedy the day after the surrender of the brigade in Cuba on the 22nd of April, 1961. The group was very interesting. If you ever could think of 4 different people trying to work together, it was Maxwell Taylor, the retired General and Chief of Staff of the Army. It was Allen Dulles, who was head of the CIA, but who was not in town at the time of the invasion of Cuba for some reason or other. Admiral Arleigh Burke, the head of the Navy, who had had more to do with the Bay of Pigs program than the chairman had, so Arleigh Burke was asked to be there. And then the real point of interest in the group, Bobby Kennedy.
Huh.
Now they met, I think I made a note on this, yes, they met 2 doors from my office. The door in the room in the Pentagon is listed on the page there. They met 2 doors from my office for all their inquiries. Now the reason I present this is a true copy of the report that Taylor gave to the President. And in this report, it states what the committee came up with as a reason for the failure of the program. And I'll just read it right out of here because I don't want anybody to differ with the way it should go. At about 9:30 p.m. on the 16th of April, Mr. McGeorge Bundy, Special Assistant to the President, telephoned General Cabell of the CIA to inform him that the dawn airstrikes the following morning should not be launched until they could be conducted from a strip within the beachhead. In other words, after they took the beachhead. Mr. Bundy indicated that any further consultation with regard to this matter should be with the Secretary of State. General Cabell, accompanied by Mr. Bissell of CIA, went at once to Secretary Rusk's office, arriving at about 10:15. Now, there's no sense of going further on that, but the entire thing is documented that the failure to fly that strike is why the thing failed. And back in the report further are the words of Dr. De Verona, who would have been the new president of Cuba had they won, and he said, "We would be in Havana today if those 3 jets had been destroyed." Now, anybody that writes otherwise is just misinformed. There are the official papers.
Now, let me ask you now. Allen Dulles, the head of the CIA, is out of town. McGeorge Bundy, President Kennedy's national security advisor, countermands the military plan for the Bay of Pigs, and as the result of that countermanding, there's a fiasco instead of a victory. What kind of conclusion do you draw from this? Were there senior people in the Kennedy administration who were consciously out to sabotage this in order to somehow or other weaken the Kennedy presidency, or what? I mean, history generally attributes the failure to John Kennedy, not McGeorge Bundy, but what you're saying here is extraordinarily important.
Well, I think it is. I think it really is. But I think we should also put it in the time. Be very careful. Hindsight doesn't make a good historian. And the Kennedy administration was new in April of '60. They had been there just February and March. Sure, yeah. You know, fairly new. You could not expect that the civilian element of the administration would necessarily have a lot of military experience. And as the paper goes on to show, that some of the people who were briefed about the significance of destroying all the aircraft first didn't realize that 3 little jets up against a whole fleet of B-26s. We had armed the exiles with B-26s, but they're slower than the jets, see, so they couldn't fight them. They didn't think that it would make that much difference. And I'm willing to side with Admiral Burke and General Taylor in saying, as they do further on, that there were misunderstandings. They didn't understand the tactical problem. Well, we could leave it there. Some people would like to squeeze it up a little tighter and say that it was countermanding the president. I think that should be a matter of choice. What I'm interested in doing is presenting the record, and the record says the words I just read. They don't give a reason, but I'd like you to keep this in mind. Every day the questions were asked of the people in that room by this committee. Bobby Kennedy left immediately in the afternoon back to the White House to talk with his brother, the president. Had there been any doubt in his mind or in the president's mind that this report, that Bundy did this on his own, is right, they would have stopped immediately. They would have said, well, now wait a minute, Kennedy told Bundy to do this, or somebody else told him. But there was no one else seeing it. That's silent. So we have to be a little careful about that, but the record speaks for itself pretty clearly. It was a very bad blunder.
What happened as the result of that? Kennedy's presented with the Taylor report, the Taylor Cuban Study Group report. What does he do on the basis of that?
Very interesting step, because in this report is not only the requirement to study the failure, but Kennedy had decided that he was not going to rely on the CIA anymore, and that he was going to have an alternative system created for the operation of clandestine operations of the United States government. And in this report, there are the words that are written by the people in the committee and by General Taylor primarily that became one of the most important national security action memorandum ever published by Kennedy, and that's the highest document our government can publish, number 55, issued in July of 1961. And essentially it says that the President holds the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff responsible for advice to him in peacetime operations, meaning clandestine operations, as he would be in wartime. Now, right away, that meant that the JCS was going to be in charge of these things. Programs would be run by the JCS under the direction of the NSC, and the CIA would not be in clandestine operations. A powerful statement, translated by Senator Mansfield and Justice Douglas, both friends of Kennedy, that Kennedy was going to destroy the CIA into 1,000 pieces. Well, that's another way to say it. But what is actually said are the words that the Joint Chiefs of Staff would be responsible to the President for advice, and they would carry out. Then also in this report is a long section on what the alternative system would be when the CIA was not involved.
Of course, the events at the Bay of Pigs occur at a kind of a critical juncture in the whole development of the Vietnam engagement of the United States. As you point out throughout the book,